Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Stray Pixels podcast, not currently sponsored by Simply Safe, which is a shame because my house is being robbed right now, and all I have to defend myself is a wooden katana and a Nerf gun I used to shame my cat. How are you guys doing?
You got a katana? Okay, shit. Okay.
It's a wooden katana.
I think the actual term is a boken.
Fair enough, but it's also definitely not made in Japan, so I don't know that I can call it really anything like that. So
somebody's been watching way too much Bamboo Blade is all I'm saying.
I watched that shit a decade ago, man. I don't know what you're talking about. I have that on DVD.
Oh, really?
How are you doing this week, Nate?
Not bad. Been really tired this week, and I'm not sure why. But
exhaustion, man.
Yeah, exhaustion. A game I didn't really like, but good news coming soon. We got Ghostwire and Final Fantasy Origins coming up. So maybe
Stranger of Paradise. Let's go.
Maybe then I'll have some life in me finally.
By the time you guys are seeing this, our review for Stranger of Paradise and our final preview for Ghostwire Tokyo will be up, but not at the time we are recording this yet. So we have just kind of been discussing it in private, but obviously we can't share that with you guys until the embargo goes up. So how about you, Bailey, as the person that got to actually play it?
Well, I can't say specifics about Stranger, but it's going to be a very interesting game to see received.
Yeah, it's one of those times when it's like, so Square Enix has put out yet another demo for a game that's going to be somewhat polarizing.
I think it's a really smart thing for them to do, but I don't know I think 3 demos is probably a little too much. I don't know.
Well, the first 2 they said were network tests, which was kind of confusing because the game didn't have much in the way of online multiplayer. So I don't like, obviously it has it because you can join your friends' games, but
so like I've been seeing this like meme on Twitter where so like Square just launched like a bunch of games, right? So they launched Babylon's Fall, Triangle Strategy, what's the other one? Oh yeah,
big month for Square.
Chocobo GP. And it's like it almost feels like every other game is bad and every other game they launch is good. So like first there was like Babylon, which was like not good, and then there was
not good.
Then there was Triangle, which was really good. And then there was Chocobo GP, which was not good. But now we got Stranger. And, hey, if we keep up with the pattern.
But the game before Babylon's Fall was Kingdom Hearts Integra Masterpiece, so that breaks the pattern.
I know, man. I beat Zora, man. I got through it. It's not my problem. Your connection
had a miserable old time.
Jesus, I didn't think Bailey was like, I worked on my system. Don't know what to tell you, guy.
You worked on my Switch. My superior model.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
So this past week, we weren't expecting to do a part 2 so quickly, but we were looking for something to discuss in that state of play. And
we could have talked about Valkyrie Profile for like 2 hours.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's played here.
I have not. I've like started Valkyrie Profile about 4 separate times, and I've never made it as far into as I actually want. And like we could talk about the game that isn't Final Fantasy Tactics. We could talk about the game that isn't Dino Crisis.
That game looks so bad.
At some point, like when we have the time and the research to do it, we could talk about games going action, especially when it comes to Square Enix. But like in the meantime, given that Final Fantasy is going to continue to be relevant into next week because Stranger of Paradise is coming out, I felt like all of us would have at least a little bit more passion for going back into part 2 of our Stray Memories series on Final Fantasy. So now it is a series.
It is a series.
Having 2 installments proves the concept. So last time we talked about the 3 games that came out for the Famicom. Only one of them came out for the NES. So Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 kind of exist in their own little bubble of games that came before what we know as even like the beginnings of modern Final Fantasy. Particularly considering their battle systems, because the games that we are going to talk about today, Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6, introduced the active time battle system, which kind of formed the basis for combat going through the next like dozen installments almost, because like we even still see shades of it in some of the newer mainline titles. It's not the same anymore, but we see them trying to integrate it. So we're going to start with discussing Final Fantasy IV.
Nathan's favorite game.
So Final Fantasy IV obviously originally came out in the United States as Final Fantasy II, because by the time they had gotten through the localization for the first game, the third game was basically about to come out in Japan, and they were like, okay, we already know there's going to be a fourth one. We're just going to sit and wait and do that one, because the Super NES was basically already starting to come into prominence, and it wasn't worth it to make regular NES games anymore. So I think that a lot of people in our generation probably know it better for the DS port, sort of the same with Final Fantasy III, but I think that the port for 4 is a much better received product, and it's a lot improved over what we saw for 3. So I want to know what your guys' first experience was. Was it playing the DS version, or was it playing the original?
So 4 was actually the very first Final Fantasy I played, and it was actually the DS version that I played. And that game kicked my ass.
It like, so thing to know about Final Fantasy IV is when it originally came out in the United States, it was actually modified to be easier, because because Square Enix did not have faith that people in America could get through a game that was as challenging as it was in Japan. So if you look at emulated versions of the game now, you will find 2 different versions of it. You will find Final Fantasy IV, and you will find Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, which is the version of the game that we got in the United States.
That's pretty cringe, man.
So when the DS version came out, the difficulty went back up to what was found in the original Japanese version.
That makes sense.
And it's quite hard, actually. I don't know that I ever actually beat the final boss. I got all the way up to it. I beat all the optional content, but I don't know that I ever beat.
Yeah, I've played 4 on DS and PSP. The PSP version comes with the after years, which I don't know if we're going to talk about the after
eventually.
Years.
We will talk about after years eventually.
But, the PSP version, I think, is probably the better way to play, because you have the entire package there. But I'm like really, I still find the DS like remake pretty impressive for what it was at the time, because like they really just like add like I wasn't expecting like voice acting and like actual like cutscenes. I was like, oh shit, this is like serious.
I know that was kind of impressive, because that wasn't something that we saw in Final Fantasy III. It was like actual like rigged cutscenes with voice acting. So I remember the first time one of them appeared in 4, like I was like, oh my gosh, my DS can actually do this. And then I remember being like kind of emotionally affected by the scene where you meet Rosa for the first time, because that is one of these cutscenes, and the extremely famous love theme from 4 starts playing in the background, and it's like this really nice like reorchestrated version. Oh my god. Oh my god, it's so pretty. How about you, Nate?
Oh boy.
So once again, I'm going back to my college years, and 4 was part of the ones I played during that time. I did not play the DS or the Super Nintendo version. I instead played the GBA port, and that's how I experienced 1 through 5 minus 3, because 3 was only on DS. So that's how I personally experienced them. And yeah, I think even for the GBA, the game was made with the original American cart ROMs. So the game wasn't very hard. I breezed through the game pretty easily, and enjoyed my time with it. up until a very specific scene in the volcano, not in the volcano, but near the end where you're going up to the lunar whale. This ending scene has made it so Final Fantasy IV is bar none my least favorite Final Fantasy.
Monka easily. Monka.
I haven't played 6 really. Which funny enough, I have a better time with 6 memories with it, but like 4 because of this thing, I got so emotionally invested that when this thing happened.
You just go ahead. This is yeah. Like, you got to say what it is at this point.
Okay, so during the time you lose party members, like in Final Fantasy II, yes. The twins get frozen, get turned to stone, saving you. Sid falls into a volcano and quote unquote dies, and then one more character I can't remember now.
Mm-hmm. Or oh my gosh, Yang. I believe Yang also does not make it to the end.
Yeah, except that they totally do, because they come back right before you hit the lunar whale, and it's like, oh hey, everybody's cool, and I about threw my system when that happened. I'm kind of shocked
that's what really upsets you.
So, and this is actually something that's different depending on the version of the game that you play, because in the Super Nintendo and the GBA versions of the game, you can like re-add them to your party. You can go into the end with whatever party you want to. The DS version, you have a fixed party that does not change, and what they did instead was give you items that would allow the characters that were in your end game party to learn the abilities of the characters that you were missing. So I think that kind of cleaned up that story moment. You don't really, I think you like get glimpses of them, but I don't think you ultimately see that they're alive until the end of the game, if I remember correctly. I mean, obviously Palom and Porom don't actually die. They get turned to stone, which is a thing that is theoretically reversible, but it's very, very difficult to do.
So, the issue with it though is I fully expected that I was just messing for them, especially because I actually really enjoyed them, was I was just missing a side quest to go back and actually save them or something. So the fact that got resolved off screen without any input from the player really annoyed me. And at this point, you have to remember that 4 and 6 are considered by the old time fans, those two are the games. Those two are it, 4 and 6. People don't care about 5 really too much, but they say 4 and 6 are better than every other Final Fantasy. So these are the best. You can't go any higher. And I vehemently disagree with 4.
So what's kind of interesting, Nate, is so I dislike 6 for similar reasons, but I don't dislike 4, right? And I almost, so like my like theory here, all right? And I could be just off base here. I don't fucking know. But like when I was like really young, right, and I played these like really old RPGs, I didn't really expect like the stories to really hit me, if that makes sense, right? So like when I played like old Dragon Quest games or like old Final Fantasy games, like I didn't really expect there to be like really like gripping stories. So like when I played 4, right, and like because that was my very first one. I didn't really expect there to be like a really like, so like I had my expectations like really shot, like because I played the DS version first, right? And that was like already far beyond what I was expecting. So when I reached that point you're talking about, I didn't really like think about it that much, right? Whereas I suppose if you have more experience with the genre, like how we had when I played 6, it could be it could be kind of like disappointing,
And it's kind of funny that you say that about saving Palom and Porom, because that was one of the features that a lot of people really desperately want out of 6 was a side quest or an optional path to save a specific character that dies. But I think that with 4, so let's like go into a little bit of like the actual details of the game. So 4 is the first game besides the first one that really has moments that I would say are signature for the entire franchise. The two that most immediately spring to mind being the opening sequence of the game where Cecil, not knowing what he's doing, travels to the village of the summoners and burns it the fuck down. Because he doesn't realize that his king has gone insane. And you end up having to fight Rydia, who summons Titan, who
embodies you.
Yeah, who bodies you and like wrecks a wide portion of the world map in the process of doing so. And then the other one that's very, very famous is the part midway through the game where Cecil has to confront his himself as a Dark Knight and become a paladin. Like, words cannot express how hype this was. This was like one of the very first RPGs that deconstructed itself in this way, that like actually looked at its main character and was like, okay, we're actually going to have these people like develop like demonstrably. So you have Cecil, who changes classes. You have Kane, who has to work to like establish his trust with the party after he is brainwashed and betrays them several times. You have Rydia, who disappears partway through the game and comes back as an adult. And it's kind of crazy how much they suddenly started focusing on the narrative and the characters. And not all of them quite hit it out of the park. I think that Rosa's a little bit underdeveloped. Her major motivation is basically just wanting to be with Cecil. And I think that everybody makes fun of Edward. I actually like Edward. Oh, you Spoony Bard, also a signature moment. Tella yelling at Edward because he thinks it's Edward's fault that his daughter died.
Feels bad, Mom.
Feels bad.
So you have a cast that rotates in and out through basically the entire story, and it's kind of like the whole game is basically a better version of 2. Because we're going for a story with a very similar tone to that. But you actually get characters that get developed as opposed to staying pretty one note for the whole time. And you don't have to put up with the stupid leveling system. This one goes very back to basics, where every character is assigned a class that they don't really change unless the story demands them to, and they just have a straightforward leveling path, and it makes it very, very simple, which means that they can ratchet up the difficulty because it's much easier to balance the game.
I did like how in the DS version, I don't think the PSP version of this, how they had those like how they had those rewards for like clearing out the maps. That does like a really cool way for like to incentivize exploration more, you know.
And it's also kind of notable for being really the only game in the series where it's fairly debatable which version is the definitive version, because you have the DS version, which has been ported to different consoles the same way that the DS version of 3 was, but then you have the complete collection version on PSP, which goes back to the pixel presentation but cleans it up sort of the way that we see in the pixel remasters. Adds extra content, and again adds the sequel, Final Fantasy IV: The After Years.
The After Years.
Eventually we are going to talk about it, but it is somewhat tangential to discussion of the original game because it came out way after the fact. Like the After Years was originally released as a WiiWare title.
That's pretty crazy, actually.
And it was released in purchasable episodes. So it is so far removed from Final Fantasy IV that it's not really worth talking about, when we're discussing the main game.
I do kind of wonder, like I didn't think about like the After Years like prior to this, but like I wonder like if you could even consider like the 4 pixel remaster to even be worth it. If you could just play the PSP version.
Yeah, it is kind of notable that that we haven't really heard anything about updating the complete collection content and After Years specifically, which means that as of I don't believe it's currently purchasable available, because I think that the PSP store has shut down, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't believe that there is any way to purchase Final Fantasy for the after years legally at the moment.
Here's what's weird is that the PSP store is down, but every title from the PSP store is available on the Vita store.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
Was it available digitally?
Yeah.
Because I don't remember.
Yeah,
Square had a couple
sure
games that were not. Okay.
I think all the Final Fantasy
Yeah,
games were.
Crisis Core is not. Crisis Core was never.
Oh, that's fucking okay.
Because Gacked.
Yo,
Yes.
Gacked, our bro. When's the Crisis Core episode?
We're gonna spend a whole episode on 7 next, so that will be
talk about Gacked for an episode.
just Gacked.
Yeah, just Gacked.
We'll just recite Loveless.
I'll just play Vocaloid music.
Yeah.
So 4 came to us as 2, and I don't really think that is nearly as well remembered as the American release of 6. You don't hear a lot of people talking about Final Fantasy 2 when they mean 4 these days. So I think that it got kind of overlooked, but what really got overlooked was the next game that did not come to us until it was ported, which was Final Fantasy V. So 5 is a huge shift in tone, about as jarring as the transition that I just made into this game. 5 has a much lesser focus on a serious narrative. It has a much goofier, sillier overall atmosphere. It has a lot of moments that are basically just pure comedy. It has entire comic relief characters in it, and it's kind of just a good fun time. It's not particularly well remembered, but in terms of mainline Final Fantasy games, this is the definitive job system game. It basically took everything that we got in 3 and amplified and refined it. So there are more jobs, there's more stuff you get to do with them, there's less individual grinding for them. And it's a much cleaner and easier to use system than it was in 3, where the game in 3 you get penalized for switching jobs for a specific amount of time, and they were like, oh, that's stupid, and they didn't do that again. But the thing with 5 is that a lot of people don't really remember it because it's surrounded by 2 games that are much more beloved.
What's the fucking FF5 remake in the 7R engine?
That's kind of one of the reasons why a lot of people don't really remember it, is because I mentioned this in the first episode. So when Final Fantasy 3 and 4 were done being remade, people immediately obviously started asking, where's the 5 one? And the series producers were like, okay, we could do 5, but in order to do what we'd want to do with it, it would have to be on more powerful hardware. So obviously the 3DS comes out shortly afterwards, and we're all waiting, and it never happens. And instead we get the absolutely awful mobile ports of 5 and 6, where they redid the artwork into weird cartoon like smear paint styles that no one liked, and the interface was bad, and then they ported those versions of the game to PC.
The best version.
So we were kind of robbed of a Final Fantasy V remake that could have like done the game an amount of justice, and I don't think that we're likely to get it at this point.
Did they ever say like what they wanted to do with 5?
Not really, just that it was going to be too graphically demanding, which I don't know that I really buy. I don't know what in 5 would be harder to do than 4. Like I remember the lunar whale on 4 was pretty impressive as a model that appeared on the Nintendo DS. I don't really know what in 5, unless they were like, oh, we don't know how to make the void stuff look cool with the DS hardware. But I mean,
the only thing I could think of is that they didn't want to do the models for each and every class.
That's kind of where my mind landed, was that would be a lot of work, and they didn't want to admit that would be a lot of work. But so Nate, I'm assuming that you originally played the GBA version of 5, which is actually to this day the most feature complete, because none of the following versions of the game included the extra content that was in the Game Boy Advance version.
Which it kind of like, it is weird if the Pixel remakes don't even include all this extra stuff, because it's like, no, we want to take you back to the past, but I want all the extra content. I want, people want and need these games to be 100% feature complete on one hardware, and not just, you get this here, this there, pick your poison type of deal. But yes, I played GBA version of 5, and I actually quite enjoy it. I enjoy the lightheartedness. 4, I feel like took itself a little too seriously in points.
Oh no.
And sometimes 5 goes a little too far into the silliness. But overall, it came out with characters that we love to this day. Gilgamesh is in 5.
Gilgamesh, the meme lord of the franchise. I adore Gilgamesh so deeply. Technically every version that has appeared across basically all of the games is still the same Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V. It is Gilgamesh morphing time. And I especially love, he got an event in Opera Omnia that I really liked, because like every time he sees Bartz, he immediately just assumes that Bartz is there to fight him, and he gets really confused when he's like, "No, dude, it's okay, stop," and he's like, "What?"
That leads into my favorite moments in World of Final Fantasy, where Gilgamesh is running around just screaming Bartz.
That's really good.
Like it is exactly the right way to do a one note character like that, where like you just lean into, no, it's funny because this is like, he's this immensely powerful character who is of such a singular mind that like he almost can't think of doing anything else besides hunting this one guy down to fight him. And that kind of echoed into a bunch of other characters that would come later in the series. Like, my God, what's his name? The new guy that rides the motorcycle from Final Fantasy VII Remake is very, very Gilgamesh.
The fucking Demix guy. The Demix guy.
Basically.
Yes.
Because he's, you got to write 1090, 10% in the front, 90% in the back.
Yep. His hair too. And
his
5,
Roche. Yeah.
Thank you.
Roche.
And then 5 is also somewhat notable in terms of representation, because we got we didn't know at the time what non-binary really was as a gender identity, but we got Princess Ferris, who...
Oh, really? 5 has that?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So Ferris actually presents male for her own sake. It's sort of like Naoto in Persona 4, where she's a pirate captain and she doesn't think that her crew is going to respect her if she's openly a woman. And there is unfortunately a scene in which the rest of the characters find this out without her consent. It's a little dated.
Not as dated as Victorious.
Oh my God! No, we're not talking about this. We're not talking about this. Quentin does not need us to plug.
My name is Tori Victory. No, what's your fucking last name again? Shit. Something. Where at the end of season 1, where she says, I am victorious. She like name drops the show.
Final Fantasy V also features what I would say is one of the more memorable deaths in the series, where Galuf dies and is replaced by his granddaughter Kryl, who then after this game they liked the character enough that she's a major character in Final Fantasy XIV, and it's effectively the same character. She even has the same grandfather when she brings him up. And it was kind of amusing how this happened, because in the older games, when somebody died, like they just died, and Kryl comes in and literally picks up exactly where Galuf leaves off in terms of her level and her job progression. So she's got a little bit of a replacement Goldfish vibe going on, but I don't know. It was kind of an unexpected moment in a game that is otherwise so silly, especially since Galuf is primarily a comic relief character up until the point where you find out what his actual deal is. but it's a weird game like to look back at, because I think that most of the games since then have had elements of like the comedic tone that 5 is going for, and there are whole games that are very much going in that direction. But none of them were the mainline titles. Like the ones that come to mind are ones like World of Final Fantasy, where everything's just kind of heightened and goofy all the time. And it's kind of telling that the chibi sprites in World of Final Fantasy look distinctly like the NES and SNES models, probably for that reason. But no game in the mainline series since then has gone quite so ham on the job system. And like I said, I think that probably has something to do with how you balance the games. Because these 5 and 3 and the games that they inspired, which were the 4 Heroes of Light, Bravely Default, and Second and 2, you can break over your leg if you find the right job combinations, especially Bravely Default, which is specifically built to let you break it.
Bravely is like really stupid.
Bravely, though, it very crippling that you can actually level and do it the wrong way, and also at the end, if you figure out, oh, I've been doing my party completely wrong, you have to grind forever to get the right party.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it is kind of the same way in 5. And it's also somewhat unfortunate that the most feature complete version of 5 is not the most fun way to play it, because the Game Boy Advance version has a bunch of slowdown that it shares with a lot of the other Super Nintendo GBA ports. It's not super noticeable outside of battle, but battles are distinctly slower paced than they were in basically any other version of the game, because the Game Boy can't handle the frame rate of the active time battle, while keeping up the gorgeous and colorful visuals, which was also something very different from 5 over 4. Is it's a much more vivid and vibrant game in its art direction. Because 4 hues very dark for most of it, and 5 is like big poppy colors, and that's reflected in the outfits for a lot of the jobs too, in the character designs. Nate, do you have a favorite thing about Final Fantasy V?
Final Fantasy V, I think I kind of mentioned it earlier, but it is that sillier tone that I've kind of come to really like about it. And other Final Fantasies don't really get there. 9 gets really close to it, and I think that's why 9 is probably my favorite. It's a healthy mix between the melodrama of Final Fantasy and the more goofier aspects of it. And
my favorite scene in 9. Yeah. I'm sorry.
You're good, man.
9 is stupid.
We'll get to 9. I promise.
We'll get to 9.
I have great personal investment in us getting to 9.
Yes. And the job system. I was really surprised at how in-depth it was. With previous games, even in 3, I felt a little restricted, like there, but with 5, it really felt like, oh, I don't really need to worry about my job so much. I could do whatever I feel like. And I did. It was the first time I really started using Blue Mage. I think it's technically the first time Blue Mage has ever been there, right? Yep. And I thought that was fun. And overall, like 5 feels like instead of focusing so much on story, they instead decided to go whole hog into gameplay. And for that reason, it probably feels like the most in-depth Final Fantasy.
You're not going to see a mainline ever do that. No.
No. I mean, the other thing is that like with newer Final Fantasy games, like they're expected to go in like to be in depth with all of this stuff. So you still see like minor integrations of stuff like the job system, like even in Final Fantasy 12, the international version, or what we now have as the Zodiac Age, integrated a form of the job system. It was much more restrictive because you had to lock characters into jobs, but you could pick whatever you wanted for whoever you wanted. You have skill trees in Final Fantasy 15.
The Crystarian
that kind of Yes, the paradigm system in 13. And most obviously, you have Final Fantasy 14, which sells itself a lot on the back of how flexible its job system is because of its biggest competition, so infamously locking you to one job per character, and you have to make a whole new character if you want to do a different thing. So it's kind of notable that, like, in terms of a tangible legacy, I think 5 probably has the biggest one, given that there's like literally an entire series that we would not have if not for 5's influence.
What if we do like an April like Fool's Article, right? And like it's about like if 14 is actually a remake of 5.
I mean, so there is a very Final Fantasy 5 centric raid series in 14. That is the raid series from Stormblood that hews very far into some of the void and the multidimensional concepts that were first introduced in 5. 5's story is goofy. And it's hard to remember a lot of it, but it goes into.
Are you talking about Void Arc? Because Stormblood was Rabanastre, wasn't it?
No, I'm talking about Omegascape.
Oh, Omegascape. Yes.
And honestly, I'm going to go for a funnier direction. I love that we got a Chocobo character. This was the first first game in the series that put any emphasis on one of the big mascot characters of the entire franchise, which are the Chocobos. And I love the Chocobos. I will adore them in all iterations, and I feel so bad for what they did to Alpha in Chocobo GP Racing.
Feels bad for Chocobo GP, man.
Feels bad.
When's the episode about Chocobo GP?
I'm not paying money for it, so
you don't have to, Colin. It's free.
Oh yeah, you play the stupid light version.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the big one from the Super Nintendo days, the one that is most commonly held as one of the 2 best games in the entire series. And one which we have very varying levels of personal influence and meaning, but I think we all have a certain amount of understanding of, and that was very vague, so we're going to cut that part out, but we will be right back. Welcome back. In the first half of this week's episode, we took a look back at Final Fantasy 4 and 5, and we have devoted the entire second half of the episode to what is widely considered to be one of the greatest games ever made, unless you ask one of us. So, Final Fantasy VI obviously was originally released here as Final Fantasy III, came out in Japan in April of 1994, and came out in the United States in October of 1994, exactly 1 week before I was born. So obviously I did not play the Super Nintendo version. I personally played the GBA version of this game, but 6 is somewhat, and by somewhat I mean extremely notable. It is the final 2D Final Fantasy mainline title. It contains even more scenes than 4 that I would consider to be signature scenes of the entire franchise, most notably the opera, which may be like one of the first things that you think of when you think of classic Final Fantasy games, and was recently completely redone for the Pixel Remaster. It was the most work that had been put into any element of any of the Pixel Remaster games, was completely dubbing the opera scene. So that was really cool. And it's also one of the more freeform games in the series without including the same job system that you would see in 5 and 3, because of its massive ensemble cast. There are arguments over who is the protagonist of Final Fantasy VI, because there are so many characters and several of them have protagonist energy. So this is kind of a game with an extremely broad legacy. This was the final game that was published on a Nintendo platform. to this day, we still haven't seen any Final Fantasy mainline titles released first on a Nintendo platform. Although we have now finally seen them starting to go back with the remasters of 10, 10-2, 9, 7, 8, and 12 all being on the Switch. So Bailey, you are you out of the two of you have the most experience with 6. So how did you first play this game?
I played 6 a lot. So I first played it actually on stream. I played the not so great Steam version.
Yeah, the poopy mobile port.
Yeah. And then I dropped it like when you reach like when the world gets fucked. Then I played through the GBA version, and I played through the Pixel remaster recently. And like I'm not like, so like I have a really weird like history with this game. So like I don't think it's like dog shit or like anything like that, but like I just think coming from where I first played it, because I played it like after I played like 10 and like 12 and like 9 and 8, like I was expecting more because it's like really hyped up. And I just found it like kind of disappointing, primarily because of the cast, but we could get into that later probably.
Sure. And that is kind of something to note about 6, is that there are a lot of characters and they do not receive an equal amount of screen time in development. So some of them, like Gao, kind of languishes. He does not really get any development. He's actually one of those characters that I think gets somewhat redeemed by his appearance in Opera Omnia, because he gets like an actual, character arc, as opposed to just being the wild child that you meet in the middle of a fucking field. And he likes animals, and that is his characterization in 6. But countering that, you also have several of the most beloved characters in the entire series, most notably Celis, the Magic Knight, who is like probably on everybody's Final Fantasy top 10 waifu list.
We just did a top 10 protagonist waifu list for JRPGs, and she's on there.
Yep. But 6 is also very, very noteworthy for being the first Final Fantasy game that I would say goes really dark.
It's really fucked.
So I mentioned deconstructive elements in 4. 6 takes that and runs with it because the villain wins in 6. So 6 is very evenly divided into 2 halves. In the first half is very linear on rails. You go one place and then another place and another place, gathering up your party members and basically rallying your forces to defeat Kefka, who is basically about to enact an apocalypse plan for the lulls, and he's tricked the emperor of the evil country into helping him with his goals. You actually get to what feels like almost a final confrontation much sooner than you're expecting to when you go up to the floating continent. There's a whole dungeon, you fight him and you fail, and he basically wrecks the entire world. And this is something that this is an idea that gets revisited later in the series. So it's most notably in 8, where near the end of the game, Ultimisia breaks time and severely hampers your ability to explore the rest of the world, because so much of it is locked out. And there's also a little bit of it in 9. Once Memoria appears in the sky, you're locked out of a bunch of the locations. But in 6, it's the whole world. The entire world map basically gets World of Warcraft cataclysmed. And notably, the second half of 6 is almost completely non-linear. Theoretically, if you wanted to, you could take Celis and go right to the final dungeon. You shouldn't, but you could. And that sort of open world sandbox element isn't something that had really been seen in Final Fantasy beforehand, where usually you would just get the airship partway through, but by that point you've already done like most of the stuff that you can do in the world, and there's not a whole lot else to explore. And in Final Fantasy VI, no, you go across the entire game over again. And try to gather up what remains of your group of friends who have been scattered to the winds in the ensuing time skip, because Celis was in a coma. So Nate, I know that you have some familiarity with this game.
Yes.
What did you play it on, and how far did you get?
I played it, so I actually kind of split. I did start it on both the GBA and then kind of dipped out pretty early on. And then I played the PSN re-release of the PS1 version. Which, yeah, not great.
As has been mentioned.
As has been mentioned. I played that on the Vita or PSP for a little bit. And I got up to, like I said, I have vague memories. I remember suplexing a train. And I think that's about as far as I got, and then I kind of just dipped off of it because at that point, when I was going through my college game spree of Final Fantasies 1 through 6, I picked up Persona 2 to be precise, and I started playing that instead because that caught my interest a little bit more.
It's kind of go ahead.
And it's funny that you mentioned that so many characters are a thing, because with what I've played, I would have said Terra is 100% the main character.
They present her at the beginning, kind of like that way, but it gets very like muddled, like the further you get in.
Okay.
So the opening of 6 is also pretty memorable. Basically, you open on the credit sequence is actually one of like the signature moments that I've mentioned before, where it's the Terra and her 2 Magitech captors trudging across a field of snow as the opening credits play, and you're walking towards Narsh, where the game begins, and you play as a girl who is basically being brainwashed and hypnotized to do the Empire's bidding. And the prologue effectively ends with you getting the crown off and meeting Locke, who is kind of an iteration of the Edge character that we saw in 4, and I would put him somewhere between Edge from 4 and Zidane from 9. But this establishes Terra as a main character pretty early, but in the second half, especially because you start playing as Celis primarily, she is much more defined as the protagonist of the game going forward from that. But this is one where there's arguments either way. Officially, it does seem like Square has decided that Terra is the main character because she is the one that shows up in all of the crossover spin-offs. She's in Dissidia. She was the first one in Opera Omnia. But
and correct me if I'm wrong, in the logo for 6, it's her on the Magitech armor, right?
Yes, it is. That is the logo. She's also on the box art. Funnily enough, it's a logo of her in the Magitech, and then it's basically an image flip of the actual picture of her in the Magitech, which she doesn't get back in. That's only the beginning of the game. So that's kind of amusing as something that was notable enough to be the box art. But it kind of, I say that a lot, don't I? No, kind of.
Kind of. Kind
also
of.
notable, yes. But this game also introduces the first mascot as party member character, because you get Mog, whose special ability is dancing. He's not useful for very long, but it is very fun that you get to actually play as a Moogle, a sentient Moogle who is as tall as everybody else.
One of the funniest parts to me in 6 was like near the start where you're like with like Locke, and you have like the 3 pathways with the fucking Moogles.
Oh my god, yeah, there's like a little defense mini game in the beginning of the game where you have to defend Terra because she's knocked out, and you have to play with all of Mog's friends. And like, I think that 6 pretty well blends the tones of 4 and 5 while also managing to go much deeper into the serious tone of 4. Which four's comic relief moments are a little bit jarring, and I think that in 6 they're a little bit more evenly sprinkled, and you have like characters whose attitudes are like, we can take this seriously, but we're also kind of here to lighten the mood. Like you have Prince Edgar and you have Setzer, who are both like, you know, we're here for a good time, like we're gonna help you out, but we're also here for a good time and for the party camaraderie. Which immensely helps with the mood of the game. And you have the second romance, but the first developed romance of the series, because you see Locke and Celis have a thing for each other, as opposed to Cecil and Rosa starting the game already in a couple. And romance from here becomes a much greater focus of the series, because you see that being a heavy theme in 7, 8, 9, and 10, all of which to some degree almost revolve around unfortunately heterosexual romances, but romances nonetheless that develop over the course of the game.
I think 12's the first one to like not have
12's focus on its greater plot as opposed to the individual characters kind of robs it of that. Like you get a feeling that at first Vaughn might be crushing on Ash, but I think it's mostly just because she's a pretty girl.
My OTP.
It's much more present in Revenant Wings than in 12 itself, because you get Vaughn and Pinello kind of exploring the idea that they might have a thing for each other. But Tactics does not really have a romance plot. 13 has a romance, but it's very much in the background for the first game. And 15,
you could argue with 13 that 15. Hope and Lightning were supposed to have a weird romance subplot.
I think the sequels for 13 kind of imply that more too.
Yes. In 13 itself, that's absolutely not a thing. But once Hope gets aged up, it becomes more of a thing that he has a crush on her. It's not reciprocated, but
it's not. When they're in when we see them in quadratum, we don't know.
Oh my god.
Sora walks up to Hope.
But it is kind of notable that like what is ultimately a minor plot element here ends up becoming such a massive theme of almost the whole rest of the series. As things started to focus a lot more on melodramatic character moments between the cast. And yes, it's too big this time, but you also, that doesn't rob you of having important moments like Terra self-actualizing and deciding that she actually does want to fight for a cause, because she kind of resists the idea after being brainwashed and coerced into fighting for the Empire. And you have several characters that defect from the Empire's side, and you have, like I mentioned before, a notable character death. General Leo, you play as him for a short period of time, and then he dies, and a lot of people wish that there was a way to save him. Which would of course make the cast even bigger. And then you have some of the most memorable music in the series. Like I said, the opening credit theme, extremely so. But it's also, I would say, easily the most ambitious of the 3 Super Nintendo games, because even though you have like multiple overworlds in 4, because you have the ground, you have the underworld, and you have the moon, I would say that the actual storytelling in 6 goes much wider. Obviously, the world gets, leveled. But this is where I would say the beginnings of the expansion of the scope of the Final Fantasy series started. So Bailey, you had alluded to the character moments in 4 reminding you of why you didn't like similar moments in 6. Do you want to expand on that at all?
So like the thing with 6 is I really love the idea of its plot. I just think it's and I think it's just like when you reach the second, like I think a lot of my problems are primarily where the game opens up in the second half, where the world gets fucked, because there's a lot that happens with the cast that you just don't see happen. There's a lot of
a time skip.
Yeah, and there's a lot that I feel like they could have expanded upon or done more with, but they just didn't do it. So like one of the ones that kind of stands out to me the most is so when the world gets fucked and you're playing as Celeste and you get back like I think like Sabin, and you find back like and you find back his brother, I think his name is Edgar. Yeah. When you find him, there's like they don't really acknowledge each other, and I was like
yeah,
it's like so like Sabin's like, oh, you're here, Edgar, and like that's kind of it. And it's like it sounds stupid, but like that kind of and like that's how like a lot of these like interactions go when you go and like and like you like reassemble the party. And I just find it like really like underwhelming for the second half.
And it obviously it's because the game like can't account for every possible combination of party members that you could have when you find someone. And that's like that is something that I think that we see get fixed in later games that tried stuff like this, where the party members that you have aren't necessarily fixed. It was something that I actually recently noticed playing through Trails of Cold Steel 2, where for a lot of the game you have certain party members that are fixed, and you will notice that they have a lot more dialogue and a lot more voiced dialogue in all of the cutscenes. But the characters that you just decided to bring with you do also have dialogue. They have stuff to contribute to a conversation, and it does seem like nowadays you can put in the work a little bit more to actually try and account for the different like people that could be with you that should have something to say about a situation. But like, it's also just the size of the cast in this game.
I think just like also accounting for back then too, like this is like a big fucking deal. So I don't really like think it's like a game like ruiner, but like depending on your perception of like the whole genre and like how much experience you have with it, like it could seem like a little, you know, like a little like they're like when you refine like Terra after the like time skip happens, and it's like I like so like her whole thing is like she's like with these kids and she's like looking after them, right? And it's like a really cool idea, and it's kind of like, and I like how they still focused on her when she wasn't really, so like the way they handled the whole protagonist thing in 6 is probably my favorite thing about it, because it's the only Final Fantasy I've played where I could honestly call a number of the cast protagonists. Like I've seen people say that like even like Locke could kind of be
like I said, there's arguments over who the real main character is.
And I just think there's like it's a really like weird kind of like gray problem, because there's a really like kind of well even split with the cast, but because of that there's also not as much focus as I feel like there could have been. And it's also kind of why I feel like 6 of like aside from 8 maybe could probably like benefit from like a fully fledged remake the most, I think.
And it does seem like that's something that Square Enix like has had in the back of their mind. So when Final Fantasy VII Remake was still in early stages, it had been announced, but we didn't have any clue when it was coming yet. Tetsuya Nomura did say that he still wanted to remake 5 and 6, but obviously it's been this much time. We have no idea, you know, we could speculate forever, but we have no idea who they would ask to do it, because all of their teams are obviously busy. You have their main team presumably working on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. You have the Osaka team presumably working on Kingdom Hearts, and then you have the third team working on Final Fantasy 16. So you'd have to farm it out to probably an entire different company. And we have no idea what form that would take. We don't know how much interest there still is in them doing it, considering that they are marketing the Pixel remasters as the definitive editions of all of these classic games, even though that's observably not true for most of them. but I think that I agree that 6 is in desperate need of like a huge scale remake, and I think that unlike 7, you could feasibly do it all in one title.
It's not that long of a game.
Because I think that it's almost like an inverted Final Fantasy 15, where the beginning of the game is very on rails, and then you open up into an open world in the second half.
Yeah.
So I think that having a scope similar to that would make it doable in one title, but you'd have to find like a group that could do it justice, because the thing about this game is that it is so beloved that anything of like even remotely below fantastic quality is going to be poorly received.
They can't pull a fucking Secret of Mana remake on it.
No, they cannot. And I also, you know, I think that because you have so many moments that are so critical to the legacy of the series, like obviously, like I said, the opera scene,
the opera is fantastic.
Is like, it's moving to this day, and I think that like that by itself is such a definitive moment that if they weren't able to do it justice in a remake, like people would immediately hate it. So it's kind of stuck in a hard spot where I think a lot of people want to see it done, but I don't know that enough people want to see it more than they want to see, you know, Kingdom Hearts, whatever the heck, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, and Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah. So there's a really weird. So like this is like a bit off track, but there was this whole leak with the NVIDIA's like whole like database thing, right?
Sure.
And so far that whole thing has proven to be pretty accurate, like scarily so. It's predicted. It's like preemptively like predicted like what a lot of upcoming games will be and what their release windows and dates are. On that list is Final Fantasy IX Remake.
I know. Believe me, I know.
Who the hell wants a remake of 9?
So I think that a lot of people would enjoy that. And there's also, so we'll get into this more in another episode, but there is also a children's anime adaptation currently being made of 9. So I don't really know what form that's going to take, the anime or a theoretical remake. And to be clear, when I say stuff like that, like a remake for 5 and 6 isn't likely to happen, that doesn't mean that I don't want it to happen. I will happily eat my words here, and you know, play Nostradamus. But it's mostly just the way that the video game industry is now. I don't really know how you would make that happen.
It's gonna be like a big, like really big, like massive scale thing, and I don't think they're gonna want to.
Exactly.
With 9, like I would like to see that too, but like I think 9 is probably aged the best of like any of like the pre PS2 games.
I would 100% agree with that statement. But for 6, I mean, like the best thing that I could think of in terms of like an actual realistic outcome would be making it look like the Pocket Edition of Final Fantasy 15 on Switch.
Don't do that, please.
But like that's not that far off from what we saw for the DS remakes of 3 and 4.
Oh my god.
And I'm not saying like, you know, change the gameplay or anything, but like it's a thing that's doable. I think that if you wanted to make a like one that looked like and was on the scope of like World of Final Fantasy, I think that would be like a decent stencil for this game to fit in. But it's just I don't think it's in the cards, because even though the Switch does gangbusters in Japan, I don't think that they're interested in making a game for the Switch specifically that's not going to look good when you port it to other platforms.
I also don't know if fans are gonna want something that looks like World of Final Fantasy or like a 2D-ish. Like at least I think from what I've like seen, like people would rather want like a fully scaled like big 3D type of like 7R type of style, you know?
Like I think that either that or the HD 2D style.
People love
Like
HD2D,
I think I like that's what a lot of us were hoping that the Pixel remasters were going to be.
Oh, that'd be so good.
But I do think that that would bring some renewed attention, and I think that 6 is, out of all of the Super Nintendo games, the one that I would most want to see that happen to. Especially because I think that it's the one that would fit in the best next to newer games like Triangle Strategy, Octopath Traveler, like the other games that use this style. But one can dream.
One can always hope.
So I mentioned this the expanding scope that really starts with 6, and the most direct legacy of that is they wanted to go really big for 7, and they genuinely could not because of the N64's cartridge system. So the immediate aftermath of 6 is Square and Nintendo severing their longtime partnership, and Final Fantasy becoming very, very heavily associated with the PlayStation platform from basically this point forward, because they wanted to basically take a huge risk, big money swing after 6, pour more than they'd ever made to make any other video game into Final Fantasy 7. But the problem was that they could not accomplish this on the cartridges that the N64 used without it being forced to ship on multiple cartridges, which were each quite expensive to manufacture, much more so than the CD-ROMs that the PlayStation used.
Has there been an N64 game with like multiple cartridges?
No,
right?
No.
Nope.
Even Resident Evil 2 didn't have multiple cartridges.
Yeah, the game was downscaled in order to fit on one, and that's kind of that's the only time I can think of where a PS1 to N64 port had to go as far as it did, because if I remember correctly, Resident Evil 2 shipped on 2 discs.
Yes, one for Leon, one for Claire.
So because the N64 cartridges were just so expensive to manufacture, this was the final game that appeared on a Nintendo platform for a very long time. They Square would not make another game that appeared on anything Nintendo made until Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles came out.
Super Mario RPG came out technically after 6.
Did it come out after? Okay,
after 6. Wow.
But another, like I mentioned before, a mainline Final Fantasy game would not appear on any Nintendo platform until all the Switch ports happened.
That's actually really crazy to think about.
And it's kind of funny because like it's not like Square was not integrating the brand into Nintendo. In the meantime, we got multiple Kingdom Hearts games coming out exclusively for Nintendo platforms. We got Cloud in Super Smash Brothers. We got the Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy games that came out on 3DS specifically, and then later got really bad mobile ports. I mean,
you could also count like the GBA like versions of the
but those are older games. Those are ports of older games. Just, like, and then you have the DS remakes of 3 and 4, obviously. But it's kind of like I don't think that we for a very long time after this saw quite such a substantial shift in the actual like close-knit partnership for a franchise like this. And the only time that we've seen it nowadays is when companies are buying each other out. Because now we have all these PlayStation franchises that are very likely to be Xbox exclusives from here on out.
Like Final Fantasy still feels like it's kind of Sony centric. Because you have like 7 remake being timed exclusive. You have 16 presumably being exclusive.
It is at least a timed exclusive. Yes.
Yeah, at least timed exclusive. So,
but like it became so integrated with the PlayStation brand that people like started hate mailing Square Enix for releasing Final Fantasy 13 on the Xbox 360, even though it was also coming to PS3.
Yeah,
this was like a hot button issue at the time.
Why?
Because they wanted their exclusive. So it's sort of like how you see the extremely stupid people that are yelling about the Steam ports for God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn.
Oh, I see.
It's people wanting to feel like their platform is better than all the other platforms, and why? It's because it's got this game that nobody else has. And it's kind of funny that like in fewer games it became so heavily integrated with the PlayStation platform that when it went multi-platform for the first time, there was an uprising over it.
Yeah, there was a big uproar. I remember that.
But then that was before Final Fantasy 13 actually came out, and then that was the thing that everybody was.
Man, 13, man. I can't wait for the fucking
13 episode.
We'll get to it. You were saying something, Nate. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're good. I was saying I do remember all of that because I was in high school when 13 on the release of 13 coming out senior year. So I remember like eating up a bunch of podcasts about it, and they're like, yeah, but the Xbox 360 version is going to be worse looking, and it has multiple discs. You don't have to.
Oh, right.
The Xbox 360 had played DVDs.
Oh, yeah. That's Monka.
Yeah. So it was a lot of little like nitpicks and stuff, and even going forward, I think I think the only way Square Enix is really going to be PlayStation only now is if Sony actually does buy them out, which I don't think is ever going to happen.
That's gonna be a wild
we've seen
timeline.
This partnership sort of get tightened again recently because we've got stuff like the timed exclusivity window for Final Fantasy 16. Final Fantasy 14 still has not been ported to Xbox platforms. And that's something that people have been asking for a while. Yeah. So we're seeing that be more reestablished now, but it's kind of crazy to think that it was so strongly associated with a whole different brand before Final Fantasy VII came out and the series went like actually mainstream. And we're going to talk about that obviously more in the next part of this, whenever that comes. But the aftermath of Final Fantasy VI leaves a very long trail that extends to this very day. So
Trails of Cold Steel.
It's honestly,
Sky.
So Bailey, do you have any closing thoughts on 6?
I think 6, depending on when you played it, is like a really plays a really big factor into what you think about it. Like if you played it when it came out, I assume it was like a big fucking deal. And like even like if it's just one of your first RPGs, like it could really, I think it really does a good job of like setting the boundaries of what a JRPG could be. But if you have like heard about all the hype for so long, and you've played a lot of other games from like the whole genre, it could kind of be like a little bit of a wet blanket, but it's not like a bad game, you know, by like any means.
No, I think that it is fantastic for what it is. It's really spectacular for a Super Famicom, Super Nintendo game. The scope of it is something that really wasn't seen elsewhere on the platform, even by other Square Enix titles. And I think that these 3 games, like we kind of discussed in the last episode, how there's not really much of a reason to go back to 1, 2, and 3 unless you're like specifically looking to play the first several Final Fantasy games for the sake of it. But I think that 4, 5, and 6, and I think that 6 in particular, has done a lot better job of standing up to the test of time. And I do think that it is something that if you were to introduce someone to JRPGs with it, or if you showed it to a veteran who knew what they were getting into, is something that they could still earnestly have a really good time with. So that's more or less everything that I've got to say about these 3 games. Nate, did you have anything that you wanted to wrap up with?
Yes, despite my vehement dislike of 4, I would still say there's no really wrong reason to not like it.
Sure.
Essentially those are my reasons for not liking it. and even then, there is still worth to play with it. And 5, and now even hearing about 6, I kind of feel like maybe I shouldn't have skipped it way back when.
Pixel Remaster, you can buy it right on your computer and play it after Trails to the Sky first chapter.
Yeah, but yeah, that's pretty much my feelings about it.
All right. And that is going to be it for the second part of our Stray Memories series on Final Fantasy. Thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Stray Pixels podcast. We post every Tuesday on your podcast app of choice and on the Noisy Pixel YouTube channel. Let us know in the comments if there's anything that you'd like us to talk about on a future episode, or you can talk to us on Twitter. You can find me, Colin, at the Arcane Ranger. You can find Nate at Less Than Nathan, and you can find Bailey at Orpheus Joshua, or the site itself at Noisy Pixel News. The Stray Pixel podcast is brought to you by NoisyPixel.net. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers who work hard to bring you the latest news, reviews, previews, podcasts, and more. Please like, subscribe, and follow to keep up with our future content, and we will see you guys next week.
See ya.